The most threatening individual in any setting isn't the one issuing commands. It's the one who nods politely while secretly managing every action. They grin, they concur, they seem innocuous while directing all your thoughts and actions. You've been instructed that authority means being loud, forceful, and noticeable. You've been misled. Machiavelli found that seeming powerless is the quickest route to gaining power. This tactic has been employed by history's most triumphant leaders to steer results while others vie for acknowledgement. At this moment, someone is employing this method on you. They're in your workplace, your social group, perhaps even your family. While you're concentrating on the evident dangers, they're quietly influencing every significant factor. After viewing this, you'll never perceive compliance the same way again. The illusion of powerlessness. Machiavelli resided in Renaissance Italy, where overt displays of power invited assassination, banishment, or worse. The princes who endured weren't necessarily the strongest or most belligerent. They were the ones who grasped how to seem defenseless while staying invincible. Since affection and dread can scarcely coexist, he noted, if we must opt between them, it is far wiser to be feared than adored. But even more potent than instilling fear is inspiring a false sense of safety in those who might otherwise fear you. The approach of public conformity and private governance capitalizes on a basic flaw in how humans view threats and prospects. We concentrate on obvious displays of power while disregarding subtle accumulations of sway. We fret about the individual making demands while trusting the one who seems to support our interests. We defend against direct confrontation while staying susceptible to indirect manipulation. Ponder how this dynamic unfolds in organizational settings. The worker who openly defies authority attracts notice and opposition. They turn into a recognized menace that others ready themselves to counter. But the worker who publicly endorses leadership choices while privately cultivating relationships and amassing information encounters no such resistance. They seem harmless while gathering the very assets that render them perilous. This isn't trickery in the crude sense. It's strategic placement. The publicly compliant individual often does back many leadership decisions, making their obedience authentic rather than feigned. But they support selectively, establishing credibility that they can later utilize when it's most crucial. They disagree privately before agreeing publicly, ensuring their eventual compliance seems thoughtful rather than automatic. The psychological principle behind this method runs deeper than mere cunning. Humans instinctively lower their defenses around those who appear non-threatening. We divulge information more freely with individuals who seem subordinate. We include them in discussions we'd never have with obvious adversaries. We confide our weaknesses to them because we don't perceive them as potential exploiters of those vulnerabilities. Machiavelli comprehended that information asymmetry, knowing more about others than they know about you, forms the basis of enduring power. The individual who appears powerless obtains information that powerful people safeguard carefully. They discover plans before they're executed, concerns before they escalate into crises, and opportunities before rivals notice them. This generates a paradox that Machiavelli would have valued. The more powerless you seem, the more powerful you can become. The more you appear to follow, the more effectively you can lead. The more others trust your harmlessness, the more harm you can inflict on their interests while seeming to serve them. The architecture of concealed influence. Strategic obedience isn't passive acceptance. It's active positioning disguised as compliance. The master of this method doesn't merely follow orders, they shape how orders are formulated in the first place. They don't resist authority. They become essential to authority while retaining the option to withdraw that indispensability at pivotal moments. Machiavelli acknowledged that enduring power necessitates legitimacy, but legitimacy doesn't always require visibility. The promise given was a necessity of the past. The word broken is a necessity of the present, he penned, grasping that circumstances shift and rigid stances become liabilities. The publicly obedient individual maintains maximum flexibility because their reputation for compliance makes their occasional resistance more surprising and thus more impactful. This method operates through several interconnected mechanisms that amplify each other's effectiveness. First, apparent obedience builds trust capital that can be expended at strategic moments. When someone with a history of compliance finally objects or proposes alternatives, others listen more attentively than they would to habitual resistors. Their objections carry weight precisely because they're rare. Second, public compliance creates private access. The individual who appears to support the system gets invited inside the system. They attend meetings where real decisions are made. They receive advanced notice of changes. They become trusted with sensitive information because their track record suggests they won't use it against the system's interests. Third, this position allows for strategic intelligence gathering. The compliant insider learns not just what decisions are being made, but why they're being made, who's driving them, and what alternatives were considered. This knowledge creates opportunities for influence that external critics never access. Fourth, and most importantly, the position creates the ability to fail strategically. When the publicly obedient person finally withdraws their support, the impact is magnified because it's unexpected. Organizations that depend on their compliance suddenly face disruption from someone they never saw as a threat. This is why Machiavelli advised, never attempt to win by force what can be won by deception. The word deception here doesn't mean lying, it means creating advantageous misperceptions. The publicly obedient person doesn't lie about their compliance. They simply allow others to mistake tactical compliance for strategic alignment. They let others assume that agreement in small matters implies agreement in large ones. Remember that Machiavelli's core insight was that perception shapes reality in human affairs. The prince who appears weak invites attack. The advisor who appears dangerous gets excluded from important decisions. But the advisor who appears helpful and harmless gets included in everything, including the very discussions where they can exercise the most influence. The psychology of deferred resistance. Why does this approach work so consistently across different contexts and time periods? The answer lies in fundamental aspects of human psychology that Machiavelli intuited. But modern research has confirmed we're wired to categorize people quickly and then resist updating those categories even when evidence suggests we should. Once someone establishes a reputation for compliance, others stop watching them carefully for signs of resistance. This creates a blind spot that the strategic actor can exploit. The person who has never caused trouble can cause enormous trouble precisely because no one expects it from them. Machiavelli observed that men are so simple and ready to obey present, necessities that one who deceives will always find those who allow themselves to be deceived. But the most effective deception isn't about facts, it's about intentions. The publicly obedient person rarely lies about what they're doing. They simply allow others to misunderstand why they're doing it. This psychological dynamic explains why some of history's most effective power plays have come from unexpected sources. The trusted advisor who finally moves against the leader. The loyal employee who suddenly leaves to start a competing business. The supportive colleague who reveals damaging information at the perfect moment. In each case, the impact is magnified by the element of surprise. The strategy also exploits what psychologists call the fundamental attribution error, our tendency to attribute others' behavior to their character rather than their circumstances. When someone consistently complies with authority, We assume they're naturally compliant rather than strategically positioned. We mistake tactical choices for personality traits. This misattribution creates a form of camouflage that protects the strategic actor from scrutiny. Their compliance gets interpreted as weakness or lack of ambition rather than patience and positioning. Others don't prepare defenses against someone they don't see as a threat. But the psychological advantage goes deeper than mere misdirection. The publicly obedient person often gains emotional advantages as well. They avoid the stress and conflict that comes with constant resistance. They preserve their energy for moments when resistance will be most effective. They maintain better relationships because they're not constantly fighting battles they can't win. Machiavelli would have recognized this as an application of his famous advice about choosing the right moment for action. "The wise man does at once what the fool does finally," he wrote. "The strategic actor knows that timing matters more than intensity. A well-timed withdrawal of support can be more effective than years of open opposition." The servant leader paradox. Modern management theory has discovered what Machiavelli knew centuries ago. The appearance of serving others can be the most effective way to control them. Servant leadership has become a popular concept, but few realize they're applying Machiavellian principles when they embrace it. The servant leader publicly positions themselves as supporting their team's success rather than pursuing their own advancement. They ask questions instead of giving orders. They facilitate rather than direct. They appear to follow the group's collective wisdom rather than imposing their individual will. Yet, this approach often produces outcomes that align remarkably well with the leader's original preferences. The questions they ask guide the group toward conclusions the leader favored. The facilitation process channels discussion in predetermined directions. The apparent democracy masks a subtle form of control. This isn't hypocrisy. It's sophisticated leadership that recognizes how power actually works in human groups. People resist being controlled, but voluntarily follow those who appear to serve their interests. They reject orders but embrace suggestions. They fight against obvious manipulation but remain vulnerable to subtle influence. Machiavelli understood that the most secure power comes from making others want what you want them to want. The prince who relies on force must constantly apply force. The prince who shapes desires can relax while others enforce his will without realizing they're doing so. The servant leader approach achieves this by creating alignment between the leader's objectives and the group's perceived interests. The leader doesn't impose their vision. They help the group discover it. They don't demand compliance. They create conditions where compliance feels like choice. This requires a sophisticated understanding of human motivation that goes far beyond simple manipulation. The effective servant leader must genuinely understand what their followers need and want. They must be able to identify win-win scenarios where their success genuinely advances others' interests. But within these constraints, they exercise remarkable influence over outcomes. They shape agendas, they frame issues, they time decisions, they manage information flow, they influence which options get considered and which get ignored. They appear to serve while actually leading. The paradox is that this approach often produces better outcomes for everyone involved than more direct forms of leadership. The group feels empowered and engaged. The leader achieves their objectives without creating resentment. The organization benefits from both high performance and high morale. The information advantage. One of the most powerful aspects of the obey in public, rule in private strategy is how it creates asymmetric access to information. The person who appears harmless and compliant often learns things that would never be shared with someone perceived as threatening or competitive. Machiavelli lived in an era where information was scarce and valuable. The prince who knew about threats before they materialized could prepare defenses. The advisor who understood court dynamics could navigate them successfully. The diplomat, who possessed intelligence about other states' intentions, could negotiate more effectively. In our information-rich era, the dynamic has shifted but not disappeared. The challenge now isn't accessing information, but filtering it, interpreting it, and acting on it before others do. The publicly obedient person often enjoys advantages in all three areas. First, they receive information that others filter out or withhold. People share more freely with those they trust, and compliance builds trust. The person who has never used information against others' interests gets access to information that could be used against others' interests. Second, they can interpret information without the bias that comes from being seen as a threat. When someone with obvious ambitions asks questions, others become guarded and provide carefully edited answers. When someone without apparent ambitions asks the same questions, others respond more honestly and completely. Third, they can act on information without triggering defensive responses. If a known competitor suddenly changes strategy, others prepare countermeasures. If a trusted colleague makes the same changes, others assume there must be good reasons and sometimes follow suit. This information advantage compounds over time. The person who consistently receives better information makes better decisions. Better decisions lead to better outcomes. Better outcomes reinforce the reputation for competence that provides access to even better information. The publicly obedient person becomes an information hub trusted by multiple parties who might not trust each other. They hear complaints about leadership from subordinates and concerns about performance from superiors. They learn about opportunities from some colleagues and obstacles from others. They gather intelligence from across the organization while appearing to contribute to none of the conflicts that generate that intelligence. Machiavelli would have recognized this as a perfect application of his principle that the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. The publicly obedient person is the fox gathering diverse information from multiple sources while maintaining the flexibility to act on whichever information proves most valuable. The timing of revelation. The most critical aspect of the obey in public, rule in private strategy is knowing when to reveal your true position. Machiavelli emphasized that timing in politics matters more than almost any other factor. The wise man does at once what the fool does finally, he wrote. But he also understood that doing something at the right moment is often more important than doing it quickly. The person who has built a reputation for compliance must choose their moments of resistance carefully. Resist too early and you lack the credibility and positioning to make resistance effective. Resist too late and you miss the opportunity to influence outcomes. Resist too often and you lose the element of surprise that makes resistance powerful. The optimal timing usually coincides with moments of organizational or social transition. When leadership changes, when strategies shift, when crises emerge, when opportunities appear. These are the moments when the publicly obedient person can safely reveal their true priorities without destroying their reputation for compliance. During stable periods, the strategy emphasizes building credibility and gathering information. During transitional periods, it emphasizes deploying that credibility and information to influence outcomes. The person who masters this rhythm can maintain their position through multiple cycles of change. This approach requires extraordinary patience and self-discipline. The publicly obedient person must watch opportunities pass without acting, must endure decisions they disagree with without objecting, must allow others to receive credit for their ideas. They must maintain their performance of compliance even when compliance conflicts with their immediate interests. But the rewards justify the sacrifice. When the right moment arrives, the publicly obedient person can exercise influence that would be impossible through other means. Their objections carry weight because they're rare. Their alternatives receive consideration because they're not seen as self-serving. Their leadership is accepted because it's not perceived as threatening. The key insight is that power deferred is often power multiplied. The person who could exercise small amounts of influence continuously, but chooses to wait, can often exercise large amounts of influence at crucial moments. They trade frequent small victories for rare large ones. Machiavelli understood that sustainable power requires this kind of strategic patience. The prince who wins every battle but loses the war has failed. The advisor who influences every decision but loses access to decision-makers has failed. The person who exercises obvious power but creates enemies who will eventually destroy them has failed. The modern application. How does this centuries-old strategy apply in contemporary contexts? The principles remain constant, but the specific applications have evolved with changing social and organizational structures. In corporate environments, the strategy manifests as building cross-functional relationships while appearing to focus solely on assigned responsibilities. The person who helps others succeed without seeking credit, who shares information without expecting reciprocation, who supports initiatives without claiming ownership, gradually becomes indispensable to operations across the organization. This creates a form of soft power that can be more effective than formal authority. When layoffs come, the person who has made themselves useful to multiple departments becomes harder to eliminate. When promotions open up, the person who has built relationships across the organization has more internal advocates. When strategies change, the person who understands multiple perspectives can help bridge differences. In political contexts, the strategy appears as building coalitions while maintaining the appearance of neutrality. The person who can work with different factions without being identified with any particular faction becomes valuable to all of them. They can facilitate compromises that committed partisans cannot achieve. They can communicate between groups that refuse to communicate directly. This positioning requires genuine skill at finding common ground and identifying win-win solutions. The person who appears neutral but actually favors one side will eventually be exposed. The person who appears neutral while genuinely seeking solutions that benefit everyone can maintain their position indefinitely. In social contexts, the strategy operates through what might be called social utility maximization. The person who consistently helps others achieve their goals without demanding credit or reciprocation gradually becomes central to their social network. They become the person others turn to for advice, assistance, and introductions. This social centrality creates influence opportunities that more self-promotional approaches cannot match. The person who is known for helping others can ask for help without appearing selfish. The person who has connected others can ask for connections without seeming opportunistic. The person who has shared resources can expect resources to be shared with them. The ethical dimension. Critics might argue that this approach is fundamentally manipulative and therefore unethical. Machiavelli anticipated this objection and addressed it directly. Since it is difficult to join them together, it is safer to be feared than to be loved when one of the two must be lacking, he wrote. He wasn't advocating cruelty, but recognizing that effectiveness sometimes requires methods that appear questionable to those who don't understand the full context. The ethical evaluation of the obey in public, rule in private strategy depends largely on the ends toward which it's employed. Using this approach to advance selfish interests at others' expense is indeed manipulative. Using it to achieve outcomes that benefit everyone involved is leadership. The distinction lies in the relationship between apparent interests and actual interests. The person who appears to serve others while actually serving only themselves is engaging in deception. The person who appears to serve others while actually serving shared interests is engaging in diplomacy. Machiavelli understood that human psychology creates situations where the most ethical outcomes require methods that appear unethical to those who don't understand the full situation. Sometimes the only way to help people is to avoid appearing to help them. Sometimes the only way to lead effectively is to avoid appearing to lead at all. This doesn't justify any behavior in pursuit of any goal. It simply recognizes that the relationship between means and ends is more complex than simple moral frameworks suggest. The person who refuses to use strategic methods because they appear manipulative may end up achieving less good than the person who uses those methods in service of genuinely beneficial goals. The key ethical test is whether the strategy serves broader interests or merely personal ones. The publicly obedient person who uses their position to advance shared goals while advancing their own interests is engaging in enlightened self-interest. The person who uses their position to advance personal goals at others' expense is engaging in exploitation. Machiavelli's insight was that this distinction matters more than the specific methods employed. The prince who uses harsh methods to establish order serves his subjects better than the prince who uses gentle methods that result in chaos. The advisor who uses indirect influence to advance good policies serves better than the advisor who uses direct methods that result in bad policies. The limits of the strategy. Like all strategic approaches, obey in public, rule in private has limitations that practitioners must understand. The strategy works best in structured environments where relationships persist over time and reputation matters. It's less effective in chaotic environments where relationships are transient and reputation provides little protection. The approach also requires genuine competence to be sustainable. The person who appears compliant but lacks the skills to deliver results will eventually be exposed. The strategy buys time and creates opportunities, but it cannot substitute for actual ability. Furthermore, the strategy becomes less effective as awareness of it spreads. Once people understand how it works, they become more skeptical of apparent compliance and more alert to signs of hidden agendas. The method depends partly on others not recognizing it as a method. The most significant limitation is that the strategy requires extraordinary self-discipline. Most people lack the patience to defer gratification for extended periods. They want recognition for their contributions, credit for their ideas, and acknowledgement of their capabilities. The publicly obedient person must be willing to sacrifice these immediate rewards for long-term advantages. This psychological difficulty explains why the strategy remains effective despite being widely known. Even people who understand it intellectually often cannot execute it emotionally. They break character at crucial moments by demanding credit, expressing frustration, or revealing their true priorities prematurely. Machiavelli would have understood this as another application of his observation that men are so simple and ready to obey present necessities. The present necessity to feel appreciated and acknowledged often overrides the strategic necessity to maintain advantageous positioning. The ultimate paradox. The deepest paradox of Machiavelli's obey in public, rule in private strategy is that its most successful practitioners often end up genuinely embodying the qualities they initially performed. The person who acts humble eventually becomes humble. The person who serves others eventually finds fulfillment in service. The person who appears to put others first eventually develops genuine concern for others' welfare. This transformation happens because behavior shapes identity as much as identity shapes behavior. The person who consistently acts in ways that benefit others begins to see themselves as someone who cares about others' welfare. The person who consistently defers their own interests begins to find meaning in advancing shared interests. The strategic actor who begins by calculating how to appear trustworthy often ends up becoming genuinely trustworthy. The person who starts by performing compliance often ends up genuinely believing in the value of cooperation. The person who initially serves others instrumentally often ends up serving others authentically. This doesn't invalidate the strategy. It perfects it. The person who genuinely embodies the qualities they initially performed can maintain their position indefinitely because they're no longer performing. They can exercise influence without guilt because they've eliminated the conflict between their apparent interests and their actual interests. Machiavelli might have anticipated this outcome. His deepest insight wasn't that effectiveness requires abandoning morality, but that effectiveness sometimes requires apparent abandonment of morality. The person who appears to sacrifice their interests for others often ends up discovering that serving others serves their deepest interests more effectively than serving themselves directly. The ultimate practitioner of obey in public, rule in private, becomes someone who rules by genuinely serving, who leads by genuinely following, who influences by genuinely empowering others. They achieve everything the strategy promises while transcending its limitations. In the end, Machiavelli's most dangerous trick isn't teaching people to manipulate others. It's teaching them to transform themselves into the kind of people others want to follow. The person who masters this approach doesn't just gain power over others, they gain power over themselves. They don't just learn to influence outcomes, they learn to become someone worthy of influence. This is why the strategy has survived for centuries and continues to work despite being widely known. It's not just a method for gaining power, it's a path toward becoming the kind of person who deserves power. And that distinction makes all the difference between manipulation and leadership, between taking advantage and creating advantage, between ruling over others and ruling with them. The most dangerous person in any room isn't the one who knows how to control others. It's the one who has learned to control themselves so completely that others choose to follow them. That's Machiavelli's ultimate lesson, hidden in plain sight for anyone wise enough to see it.